we are engaged in a time frame where technological change, of course, is very, very rapid. And one of those best definitions of history that I've ever heard is history is a record of change. If one thinks about it, that's a pretty good definition. So change and the future, I think, have a lot to do with this particular institution. And I suspect that David is going to reflect a little bit on that in his presentation. I suspect he's going to be somewhat general, and then he's going to focus it down so we can hear some things that may have some advice for us in looking at our future, that is, for this institution. So now, let me introduce David Pearce Snyder, consulting futurist. David Pearce Snyder, a consulting futurist who began his career in forecasting with the U.S. Census Bureau in 1959. He later served with the Rand Corporation and directed long-range planning at the IRS. For the past 40 years, Mr. Snyder and his network of scanners have monitored both print and electronic media for long-term trends and forecasts that reflect future changes in society, the economy, and technology. He's written hundreds of published articles and co-authored 5 books, only 5, David, okay, on the future. Since 1979, he's been the contributing editor of the Futurist magazine, published by the World Futures Society in Bethesda, Maryland. David also serves on the editorial board of On the Horizon and World Future Review. Before we welcome David, I want to tell you one more thing that he shared with me at a lunch we had several days ago, and I think is terribly important. You may wonder, what does he have to, why is he talking about museums, besides the fact he knows the Snyder clan here that has something to do with museums? Well, apparently, David, as a young man, worked at a museum for, what, 2 summers?
Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago.
Chicago, which I visited as a Boy Scout. And remembered the German submarine that they've got there that was captured during World War II. But David had me right there. I mean, he has worked with people in a museum environment. He has quite a bit of understanding about museums. Please help me welcome David Pearce Snyder.
Thank you, Bob. It is, in fact, a great... that's better. Great pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to share with you what I know about museums, change, and our future. I recognize that that title is kind of like a potpourri catch-all, not particularly coherent, sort of like cathedrals, canaries, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. You know, I mean, where's the coherence there? Well, with any luck at all, if I do my job right, by the time I'm finished in about 45 minutes, I will have told a story in which museums and change and our future are, in fact, all part and parcel of a single continuity. And that in that, you will understand better what the future of the Lane County Historical Society and the future of Eugene and the future of our society is all wrapped up together. Oh, by the way, how many of you, when you hear the term futurist, are inclined to think of a rigorous scientific discipline? Bless your heart. But obviously I'm going to have to work at this. So let's get rid of that. Well, in fact, I'm not only a futurist, I'm an old futurist. Right? Bob said I started forecasting back in 1959 at the Census Bureau. Eisenhower was president. And if you're going to listen to a futurist, you want to make sure you listen to an old futurist. We are humble. Right? We have made 20-year forecasts and then lived out to the end of them. And wow, that didn't turn out the way I thought. Let me go back and do this again. And it's like anything else, if you do it often enough, over years and years, you get better at it, with any luck at all. And so presumably, I am a better futurist for my 55 years of forecasting. Now, in fact, I'm not the only futurist in this room. Every one of you is a futurist. Every decision you make is intended to have future consequences. You don't make choices about the past, that's too late for that, nor even about the present. Hey, it's already happening. When you make a choice among an array of choices, you pick the choice you believe will work out best. Where? In the future. So we're all futurists. The only difference between you and me is I earn my living by being a futurist, and you live by being futurists. And I've actually made a pretty good living for 50 years as a futurist, so presumably I have some useful things to share with you that will help you be better futurists in your future. Now, we're going to talk about museums, change, and the future. We're going to start by talking about museums. What do I know about museums? Well, almost all futurists started out as historians. H.G. Wells, the father of the modern field of future studies, had a degree in the history of science. And after he had made an enormous amount of money by writing science fiction stories and things like that, he decided that there should be a discipline to study the future. And so he made a speech to the Royal Society on the first day of the 20th century, January 1st, 1900, and he said, look, there ought to be, look, in the study of history, do we have perfect knowledge about the past? Absolutely not. We've got little snippets and bits and pieces and some artifacts and some eyewitness accounts, but it's scarcely the whole picture. And then what the historian does is kind of paste these all together and fill in the spots in between where we have hard knowledge, and they tell us this is what the past was like. He says, same thing is true with the future. We don't have perfect knowledge about the future, certainly, but we do have some things that we can talk about with some certainty. And later in my talk, I'll tell you about the things we know for sure about the future. And then the futurists can piece together those things we know with the things that we can speculate on or suppose and paint a picture of the future. Wouldn't that be useful? He lived on 50 years after that, trying to convince people to have academic courses of study on the future and so forth. Nobody listened. And indeed, he forecasted there was going to be a terrible war, World War I. Nobody listened. He said there's going to be World War II. He said that in 1919, right after World War I was over. Nobody listened to him. He was the first man to conceive of the notion of an atomic bomb after he had read Einstein's paper on relativity. And he warned that was going to be a terrible trouble, and nobody paid attention to him. And so when he died, shortly after the end of the Second World War, his last book was called A Mind at the End of Its Tether. And it was a lament, it was a sad, sad book about all the things he had tried to do to help people understand the future and had failed. And I am in that same tradition, but I'm still a cheerful Charlie. I have, in fact, had clients that have listened to me and changed their own destiny, and with any luck at all, I'll be able to help you do that the same today. So what do we know about museums? Well, first of all, museums, as we understand them, as this represents a museum, is a fairly new concept. It's only about 250 years old. Prior to that, anything that we would have thought of as a museum would have been someone's private collection. A scholar, a powerful lord, or head of state, some religious leaders had museums. And if you wanted to see their collection, you would write them a letter and they would grant you permission to come and see their collection. And then in the middle of the 1600s, about the time that the scientific revolution was just bubbling up, and you had Newton and all those folks inventing what we now understand as modern science, we began to have people saying, everybody should know about this, not just the scientists, not just committees of correspondence. One of the first was a man named Hans Sohn, an Anglo-Dutch collector. And he was a princely collector. And when he died in 1670 or so, he had a house, two houses actually, two row houses in the old city in downtown London. that was the first real public museum. Anybody could walk in the door. The house was a clutter of everything he had collected over his lifetime. There were statues, there were big facades of buildings that were in the front parlor that he had gotten back from Greece or Rome. There were pictures, there were artifacts of machines from Asia, etc. And you can still visit Hans Sohn's museum today, and it's left exactly the way he left it in 1670, with a big endowment to keep it running. So, and his rules were very strict. So it's really interesting to go to this museum and see this remarkable collection of things, including some very famous works that he gathered. Over the next 100 years, the museum movement grew, largely at the hands of scientists that had come up with new knowledge. Linnaeus, the man who invented the modern system for categorizing flora and such, had a museum of plants. It's still right there. He too endowed that museum. And in Uppsala in Sweden, there is this huge manor house surrounded with little rectangular plots with every single plant in Europe that he grew, and it's maintained today. So you can go see this dictionary of plants laid out on the ground. Right? The first real public museum was the British Museum, established in 1753, and it remains today one of the great museums of the world. But little by little, around the world, other museums began to pop up. Now, if we take a look at museums in the United States, I was looking at what the data said was, well, in 1950, there were about 5,000 museums in the United States. Today, 16,000 museums. So, threefold increase in the last half century. Museums obviously have some niche in our society. We surely wouldn't have tripled the number of museums if they weren't an appealing thing. So there is a demand, and indeed if you look at the original charter of the British Museum, the purpose was public education, to let the public, the wider public, know what the scientists and scholars had discovered, so that everybody could be kept up to date. So the funny thing is that although most museums are about history, the purpose was to help people be up to date, to understand the world, and to make better decisions now. Indeed, of the 15,600 museums in the United States, 12,000 of them are history museums. So overwhelmingly, before I looked that data up, I would have sworn it would have been art museums. They're certainly more common as the primary museum of many cities. It's an art museum. But nope, it's historical museums, including 3,200 historical societies, 500 natural history museums, 2,000 historic homes that have been preserved so that we get a feel for whether it was an ordinary person and what they were like back then. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a real slave, about a real slave, Thomas Henshaw, and he lived less than a mile from where I live in Bethesda, Maryland. And the log cabin he was in is still preserved in the backyard of a suburban house in Bethesda, Maryland, and you can go visit it and get a feel for what was written in the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. What was Uncle Tom's Cabin like? Well, there it is. You can go see it. It's a wonderful experience. There's also 700 science museums and 640 children's museums. And that children's museums are where I first encountered museums personally, because where we grew up in Indianapolis, we were about 6-7 blocks, certainly walking distance, of what claims to be the first children's museum in the United States, the Indianapolis Children's Museum. It was, like many museums start out, in a big old house of a robber baron wealthy person of the 1880s who had donated the house to create this museum, children's museum. And what did it have? Well, there were lovely little dioramas showing how children dress all around the world. So this is what a Chinese child dresses like, here's what an Indonesian child dresses like, here's what a Latin American. So that was sort of interesting. And there were toys, big chunk of things about ancient toys, the earliest toys that they had found, including evidence that the children of cave dwellers had toys, which was sort of nice. It made you as a child feel like, hey, we're an important part of society. And then the great pride of place in that museum was a magnificent model carousel, a 2-story tall carousel, like a big thing. And it was in the landing of the grand staircase that went up to the second floor of this house, and the big bay window, so light shone in it. And you pulled a little string, and it would, for about a minute, go round, and all the little horses went up and down. And I never ceased taking great pleasure in pulling that string and watching that little merry-go-round go round. Then I left Indianapolis, went to work in Washington. The rest of our family all moved west in a great trek to Eugene, Oregon. And there was scarcely any reason to go back to Indianapolis for a long while. So it was about 35 years before I went back to the Children's Museum. When I went back, first of all, it was in the same place. Yeah, that's good. But it was a giant, square, windowless, modern cube. I suppose it's made of very nice marble. But other than that, it was foreboding. It did have glass doors at the entrance, but it was explained to me that light damages a lot of things, sunlight, and so it was better to have a museum where it was all artificial light. There was a nice set of dioramas. This was about children through the ages, rather than how children dressed all over the world. And it made you feel a little uncomfortable to see that children in ancient times went through a lot of terrible problems, as did their parents. And in fact, what this exhibit tells you, that childhood is an invention of modern times. That it's only been since the development of the industrial world and the productivity that enabled discretionary income and discretionary time, because until those times, there was infancy and there was adulthood. And you grew up to age 5 or 6, and then you began to help out on the farm, or you began to help out in the weaving mill or something like that. There was no time when you could be not productive once you ceased to be an infant. I said, wow, how lucky. Childhood, if I'd been born 400 years ago, I wouldn't have had a childhood. Oh, that's a perception that I had not really had and wouldn't have had it not been for the Children's Museum. So museums had done their function. They helped me reflect upon modern life and the long trajectory of humankind from the standpoint of being a child. The wonderful 2-story model merry-go-round still had pride of place, no longer in a bay window with sun shining on it. It had artificial light, but you still pulled the string and it still went around. And what's more, out on the lawn was a great merry-go-round, a carousel that had been transported from a defunct amusement park in the north side of the city and rebuilt on the lawn of the Children's Museum. Which reminded me of the fact that as my children were growing up, and we were growing up not far from a Chautauqua campus. It was one of the many campuses that the Chautauqua movement had built at its peak during the 1860s, 70s, 80s, an adult education function, by and large, which finally went more or less defunct. It was sort of like the TED Talks of 150 years ago, right? And here was this wonderful cobblestone camp with all kinds of fanciful buildings and so forth that was empty for years. And our county bought the thing and began to turn it into a arts and crafts workshop place. And one of the things that it had was a carousel, all defunct and run down. And my children all worked throughout their high school years restoring that carousel. And high school students today run that carousel, fully rebuilt by school children, and it is a focal point for the whole county school system. That's our carousel. The kids of the county built that carousel and make it run today. So The Children's Museum in Indianapolis taught me a bunch of lessons. Life and my children in dealing with museums also learned a lot. They're both now handy mechanically in ways that I'm sure they learned originally when trying to fix a 100-year-old carousel for whom there are no replacement parts down at the supply store. So that was in my childhood. Then I went off to college, and in college I went to Antioch College, which was a cooperative school, and part of your learning was they sent you off to jobs to apply what you learned in the classroom in the real world. And one of the first jobs I got sent to was the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Now, it's I don't know how many of you are even aware of it, but it's an enormous Roman classical style building with a dome and great wings and columns and so forth that originally had been the American Pavilion for the Columbian Exposition, a World's Fair in 1892 that was in celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering the New World. And all the other pavilions for this fair were built out of basically plywood and plaster, and they all got torn down afterwards. But here was this wonderful classic building, which the city argued for 20 years over what to do with it once it was empty. Finally, enough money was found from wealthy industrialists in Chicago to turn it into a museum of science and industry. And in addition to converting the building to modern scientific effects, they said, well, who's going to pay for this? Well, they had a clever idea. They said, industry will pay for this. Why would industry pay for this museum? Well, because they will have their products displayed. And to be perfectly honest about it, the Museum of Science and Industry is sort of like a giant permanent trade show, right? I mean, when you walk in, and there's lots of historical stuff, where you walk in and look up, and the great vaulted dome of the central space is filled with airplanes. There's a Stuka dive bomber coming right down at you as you walk in the front door. And here's a Spitfire right behind it, full size, hanging up there in the dome, along with a DC-3 and a Curtiss Flyer, you know. And that's just part of it. Well, in fact, if you begin to go through this museum, you turn right and you go into the domestic section. It's all about life, modern life and living. Paid for by Maytag, the appliance company. And it showed washing through the years. There's a diorama with women down at the creek side beating clothes on a rock with a stick. And eventually the wringer washer, and finally the washer with the dry cycle and the spin cycle and so forth, showing change, progress, all of that. Next, it was the communications. AT&T sponsored that. And you could actually go into a kind of a phone booth and record your voice and then hear what your voice sounded like back over the phone. It had a parabolic room so that you could stand at one end of the room and whisper like that. And 30, 40 feet away, the person on the other side could hear you whispering, just like that. Ooh, the magic of science and industry all assembled together. The American Airlines sponsored the commercial airline exhibit. There was a coal mine, a working coal mine, that you actually rode down in the cage. You went on a train that seemed to go for 10, 15 minutes underground, rolling along. It was a great effect. The walls were on rollers, and they went by the windows of the cart, and the cart shook. And then there was an area where you saw modern coal mining machinery at work. Huge behemoths that were, you know, clawing coal out of a coal face. And it's all run by union miners. I mean, it's the real McCoy. My position, the world's largest model train was there. And it's still there. It's been rebuilt, spectacular, much larger scale. It showed Chicago when I was there in the 1950s. Now it shows Chicago today. You know, towering glass skyscrapers and so forth like that. But I was in a historical function of that museum. The German submarine, the U-505, which had been captured by an admiral who was a member of the social circle of Chicago. And so when he came back, he wanted his trophy displayed someplace. And the best place was to put it in the museum. So they towed this submarine from the Connecticut Naval Yard, where it had been kept since the end of the Second World War, through the Great Lakes, required an act of Congress and an act of the Canadian Parliament, because no armed ship is permitted on the Great Lakes under a treaty that the United States has with Canada, and this was an armed ship. While it was towed in, they then put big signs up on the South Shore Drive that said, "Caution, submarine crossing." They built railroad tracks to haul this thing up and over the highway and finally next to the museum. And then they attached the submarine to the museum by covered walkways and then a ramp up, so that they cut holes in the side of the submarine so that people could walk into the side and then walk through the whole length of it. And as a tour guide, you told them about, this is the submarine. I can still give you that talk. About how much it weighed, how long it was, how long it was in service, how many ships it sank, etc., etc. And this is the electric motors, and here are the dangers of submarines. And that was when I made the first discovery of working for a museum. Large numbers of people who come to museums haven't the slightest idea about what life is really like. At the end of the tour, you'd ask, now, do you have any questions? Routine question was, is this the only submarine the Germans had? I mean, this was only 7 years after the war, guys, come on. No, they built 3,700 of them. And people just wouldn't believe that. 3,700 boats like this? I said, no, this is a small one. They built a lot bigger than that. People looked at it and said, well, I just don't understand. Did the ramps fold up into the sky? No, we built the ramps. Well, didn't it, with those holes, didn't it sink? We cut the holes in it. And we quickly learned that you couldn't get exasperated, you couldn't make fun of them. They were the public. They were asking honest questions. And so you had to be very patient and say, no, I'm going to do this and that and so forth. I went back to the Museum of Science and Industry recently, and the submarine had been so damaged by the weather in Chicago over the years that it was rusting away. It would be just a pile of rust flakes, they said. So they built a geodesic dome over it, so it's now indoors. And they painted it and fixed it all up, and still take tours, all the rest of that, but in air-conditioned comfort. In the summer, touring that submarine when it was not air-conditioned was like really hot. And a dark metal tin can that you were walking through. Well, okay, change. Change happened to the museum. The railroad train is there, but it reflects the new and bigger city of Chicago. So the exhibits haven't changed at all. There's two little galleries that have a bunch of glass cases in which there are different gear escapements, including square gears. You think about it, you think square gears would, oh yeah, they will. If they're designed right, square gears absolutely work. Or bevel gears so that they turn the direction of force from this direction to this direction, or from round to up and down. I walked into that gallery when I was back in the 1950s and saw many famous people standing and playing with childlike intrigue, making these apparently inappropriate things work together. Pete Seeger, Robert Frost, oh dear, the other great Chicago poet, escaped my mind now. Any event, but people like that. I did so well there that I was asked to come back to the museum the next year in my next job thing, but as assistant director of special events, which meant that I was given charge of the famous people who came to speak at symposia sponsored by the museum. Oh, and the museum had two big slope floor auditoriums, a big one and a small one, and they had international conferences came to that museum and drew great speakers. I got to spend 4 hours with Frank Lloyd Wright when he was in his 80s. That was a revelation. I got to spend 4 hours with Ross Kettering, the co-founder of General Motors, when he came to speak on the future of automobiles and transportation. Okay, another function of museums, not just for the general public education, but a center where people come in from all over the world to look at what the museum has to offer in the way of knowledge, perspective, history and future and all of that. Wonderful aspect of museums. Well, then I left there and went back to school and got my degree, and it went on to become first a statistician and then a forecaster and then a futurist, and not being salaried anymore, I went out into the world, and for 30 plus years I've made my living by being a consultant and talking to various corporate and government clients about the future. But I was doing that from Washington, and we've lived in Washington for half a century. A city of museums. Wow. When I first came there, there were 5 big museums on the mall. Now there are 10, and 2 more are under construction. And on a Sunday, the mall is packed with people. They're all down there to look at all these art museums, the Air and Space Museum, etc. By the way, the Air and Space Museum is the most visited museum in the world. It gets, on an average day, 30,000 visitors, and on a really big day, July 4th is a really big day for them, 70,000 people come through the doors to that museum. The Museum of Science and Industry, while I was there, and even today, has an average intake of about 20,000, and our big day was always Thanksgiving. 37,000 people visited the museum on Thanksgiving, the 2 years I was there. Mothers would simply throw their husbands and children out of the house while they were preparing Thanksgiving dinner. And they were told to go someplace and stay out of trouble. And in November, it was too cold to be outdoors, so all these fathers and their children came to the museum. But all this is some continuity. I asked, yes, Thanksgiving is still MSI's big day when we were there last year. And museums are still playing an important part in the city. They become a destination. People go to Chicago because of that museum. People go to Washington not to see their government in action, one word or two, but to see the museums. They knew those were going to be fun even if they didn't care about the politics part of it. And in fact, not only are there all those public museums free of charge, but since there's a bunch of museums there, there are commercial museums that have popped up. The Spy Museum, wow, is that popular? And you pay to come in to see the Spy Museum, or the Newseum, which is even more popular. The history of the news, the history of public relations and publishing and all the rest of that. Wonderful thing, very active, lots of public events. And the Cartoon Museum, just up the way in Baltimore. So museums aren't just for public, and they're just not for big ponderous subjects like history and so forth, but news and spying and so forth, all the subject of museum. So now, oh yes, and then finally, I, as a consulting futurist, have done a lot of programs for a number of commercial clients, including the National Association of Industrial and Office Properties, which is the big National Association of Commercial Realtors and Developers. And I've done several major reports for them, the most recent in 2007, and in this they asked me to portray a picture of the future of cities. And in that picture, based on all of the analysis that we make of what developers say, is that now cities can't just be places where people go to work and then go back home into the suburbs and are empty. That's a terribly inefficient use of that infrastructure. In fact, what they now talk about is that cities must be walkable urbanities, habitats that provide a full range of experience to live, work, and play within the city. And in fact now that is the whole idea, that the sprawl of suburbs has now begun to grind to a halt. Now the new development is all infill. We now talk about intra-urban development, that is, development within the urban area, not at its edges. Suddenly, there's been a huge comeback of mass transit to enable this new, more dense city to be livable. And you've got employers. One of my clients is Sandia Labs, one of the big national research labs down in New Mexico. They're located not far outside of Santa Fe. And the president or director of Sandia Labs went to the town of Santa Fe and said, if this town simply continues to live on its historic and artsy content, I won't be able to recruit the kinds of high-tech scientists and engineers to come to my laboratory if there's nothing here that doesn't close up at 8 o'clock at night. We need a vibrant community so that I can convince these bright young people to come and work in this community. And they have. Over the last 5 years, that's exactly what they've done. Revitalized downtown Santa Fe in order to make it, yes, absolutely, there's the oldest Capitol building in the States, where the original capital of the colony of New Mexico once was. But also lively night spots and museums. Indeed, museums are growing faster than the general employment rate in the economy. So they are outgrowing the general economy. They are a part of what everybody agrees is the vision of a future city. It's got to have an active museum community in it. So that's museums and their future. Now, the second topic is change. And change is certainly a natural part of life. As we grow up, we change. We see changes happening all around us. When I was young, my siblings were young, we got the first television set in our neighborhood. It was black and white. We didn't get color for another 10, 20 years. Right? We got, the suburbs were being built. That was new. There was lots of changing styles of clothing. Automobiles, it was a big thing. The assumption was that every 2 or 3 years, the automobile companies made brand new automobiles. And it was a big deal to see what changes had they put in the automobiles. Were the fins taller? Were the number of headlights more? All that good stuff. So we understood changes all around us. And then I went to college and I read the statement that Bob quoted here, Heraclitus, who said, "Nothing about the future is certain except change." But the great thing about that statement is, A, he was a historian. That's how we know him today. Heraclitus was a historian. Number two, he said, he lived back in ancient Greece. How fast did change happen back then? How subtly wise must he have been to judge that change was the only certain thing about the future in a world where the seasonal changes are about the only change you think would have happened? Well, no. If you actually go back and look at 512 BC, empires were rising and falling. So there was change happening, even though we think it was probably very slow, without any IT to tell you about it. So, all right, in college I learned nothing about the future is certain but change. Then I graduated and went to work and went to night school to get an MBA. And what did they tell you in all of the management courses? Change is hard. People hate change. The toughest job you'll ever have as a manager is getting people to change. And that struck me as odd because I said, well, wait a minute. Now, if change is the one inevitable thing about the future, and you're telling me that humans don't like change? Boy, are we misfits if that's the case. Well, then I went off to work at the Rand Corporation. And at the Rand Corporation, I was assigned to be a part of a research project to find out what constitutes the quality of life. This all sprung from President Johnson's attempt to create a great society, and the quality of life movement bubbled up, and they said, how do you make a great society? Well, you provide people with a good quality of life. What constitutes a good quality of life? We'll ask. So we did. We big surveys of all kinds of people, first in the United States, then around the world. We interviewed Polish coal miners, Bedouin tribesmen. It was great. And we found that all of them agreed as to what constituted a good quality of life. And in your handout, the very first table there, called Components of the Quality of Life, is the result of our research. And what we found was that the single most important thing in life was health. Much more important than anything else. And people told us everywhere. The Bedouin tribesmen said, you know, I can have much wealth, I can have many wives, I have wonderful, laudable sons, but if I don't have my health, I have nothing. And everybody said that to us. The Chinese, the Europeans, everybody said health is the most important thing. Small wonder then that health is the biggest industry in America and that we're willing as a government to spend so much money on health. It is the one thing people say is the essential aspect of the quality of health, life. But on that list, if you run down to item number 8, it said one of the things we found was that novelty or new experience was an essential part of a good life. It said, wait a minute, this says people like change. And yet all the management scientists are telling us people hate change. What we went on and found was people like change when they decide to change, when they want that change. I want to buy that new 3D camera or something. It isn't that I'm forced to change. Okay, big important thing. Because now we understand, change happens. It's all the time, it's all around us. But it happens whether we like it or not. And some change we want and others we don't. This poses a vexed question when we look at how do we build a world that's really good, that everybody is happy with and that gives us a good quality of life. Well, certainly back in the 1960s, when I was first beginning to be a futurist, there was an avalanche of change occurring all around us. The baby boomers have been huge agents of change. When they were born, most of the hospitals today were originally built for the birthing of the baby boomers. And then once they got born, they said, oh, now we've got to house them. Suburban sprawl, all those housing tracts were all to house the baby boomers, and then subsequently the families that the baby boomers had. And we had to put them to school. Most of the school buildings in America today were built to teach K-12 students from the baby boom, and then once they graduated, we needed community colleges, and then four-year colleges. Most of the buildings, most of that educational infrastructure, all built for the boomers. Throughout their lives, at every stage, the boomers have changed our tastes in food, in clothing, in music. They've given us decades of dramatic change at every stage of their lives. So, change is everywhere. And the profession of futurists that H.G. Wells had promoted suddenly took off during the 60s when we had these wonderful demographic forecasts, and we said, wow, we can look down the road and see, look at the size of this age cohort, and what's it going to do to society? Most everybody, first of all, said, wow, when they retire, it'll bankrupt Social Security. And they were saying that back in the 1950s, and sure, here we are, we're in the future they talked about, and we're worried that we're going to have to make the average age of time of retirement 69 or 70, which we will do sometime in the next 12 months. So it is possible to make instrumental forecasts of the future. During that period, as the field became a profession, there was lots of research done in terms of what can you really forecast reliably. And it turns out a great deal of the future simply cannot be forecast with any certainty at all. Politics, weather, the stock market, economic performance, none of it can be forecast with reliability because those are all complex systems and we have no way to understand or predict the behavior of complex systems. They are subject to random emergence, which is referred to in his big best-selling book, Nicholas Taleb's book, Black Swans, which you may have heard, very, very popular book about 5 years ago, all about the unanticipated things that complex systems will do for us. Okay, you can't forecast those things, but there are three sets of forecasts we can make with reasonable certainty, and they are the basis of what futurists, the good ones, do. I mean, yeah, I make it clear. There are a lot of people that make a very good living forecasting the stock market. They're not right, but that doesn't make any difference. And the same thing, all the economists that forecast economic performance, they do all right, but they're just not accurate, that's all. They can't be. In fact, one of the last things Alan Turing wrote in a margin of a letter that he wrote to the German mathematician, I've forgotten his name now, in which he said, oh, by the way, no matter how good computers ever get, we will never be able to solve complex problems. Better not to try. We should simply try to work out the solutions to complex problems among ourselves. The machines can't do it. Now, we've got a whole bunch of people called futurist types. They talk about the singularity and how it's going to be that at some point in 10 to 15, 20 years, machines will be much smarter than people and they'll be able to solve all our problems. And the man who invented computers said, oh, by the way, no they can't, don't even try. So we can, however, pay attention to the things that we do forecast, those that are driven by the inertial forces in our society. And that's what slide number 2 in your handout, the knowable inertial future certainties. We can forecast the size and makeup of the adult population 15 years into the future with certainty. I mean, everybody who's going to be an adult for the next 15 years has already been born, right? So there's no guesswork here. The actuarial companies know how many of them are going to die. That's why the insurance companies have so much money in the bank. They know exactly. So we can tell you exactly what the size and makeup of the adult population will be in 2030. That says we can tell you what the size and makeup of the workforce will be, what the size and makeup of all the consumer populations will be. Hugely important information. The second set of reliable forecasts is econometrics. We can't tell you how well the economy will perform, but we sure can tell you how big it will grow, which sectors of the economy will grow and which will decline, what kind of occupations will be in greater demand versus lesser demand. All of that, every 2 years, the Bureau of Labor Statistics makes those 10-year forecasts. They've always been right for 75 years, and they're all online. You can download them. If you've got young relatives who don't know what they want to do in life, tell them to go get the BLS occupational forecast. 925 different occupations, well, how many vacancies there will be, what kind of education is required to fill that occupation, and what their average wage will be. Now, if you can't decide out of 925 different careers, one that ought to fit you, I mean, that's what you should do. But this is knowledge that we know for sure. And finally, technologic forecasts. We can't tell you about scientific breakthroughs. You know, how soon will we have a cure for Alzheimer's? Might be announced tomorrow. It might not happen for a decade, even though they're spending billions of dollars on it. It's too complex to predict. But we can tell you what kinds of technology will be in common mass market everyday use by everybody. And that is very useful to have. Now, I've been able to make those forecasts since the mid-70s. The problem is that they are not dramatic. Futurists who want to be really, get a name for themselves and make a lot of money, make outlandish forecasts that are really not supported by the data. It was Herman Kahn who said that the coming Japanese superstate back in the 1970s, absolutely certain Japan would rule the world by this time, and it's already faded away, right? Most of these trends that are listed on that happen very slowly. It just happens, however, that because of circumstances, all of those inertial changes that we've always been able to forecast during the next 10 years will be very rapid, unusually rapid, and that's what makes this a strange time, a time of dramatic change. It's why the chattering class call what we're living in now the new normal. It's because they don't know exactly what it is. but they know there's a lot of change happening. And that's all that new normal means, you know. New, according to Webster, is something that hasn't been in existence for very long. And normal, if something's become normal, it's likely to stay that way for a while. So when you're talking about the new normal, you're talking about a lot of things that are new and are likely to stay different from what they used to be. And that's exactly the time we're in. But as a futurist, I can tell you with some certainty a lot of things that are going to happen out of those inertial changes. And that's slide number 3, the graph number 3, that wonderful set of roller coaster curves, which shows the changing age makeup of the U.S. population from 1950 through 2020. And when we talk about we live in an aging society, everybody says, well, yeah, we all understand that. No, you understand. It's going to get much older real fast over the next 10 years. And you can see that the over 65 population line runs along 14% for most of the last 50 years. And over 65-year-olds have been a fixed 14% of the population. Starting this year, they suddenly shoot up and pass all other age groups. So by the end of this year, the over 65-year-olds will be the largest single age group in our society, in adult society. By 2020, 20% of all the adults in America will be over 65. By 2025, a quarter of all of the adults in our society will be over 65. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 people you run into on the street will be over 65. Geezers will rule, man. It's going to be wonderful. Now, because we know that over 65-year-olds consume more than 2/3 of all the healthcare products and services in the economy, and we know that that share of the population is going to increase by 3/4 over the next 10 years, we know that healthcare, which is already the biggest industry in America, will simply soar. It's 17% of the gross domestic product now. By 2020, it'll be 20% of the gross domestic product. And by 2025, a quarter of the GDP of this country will be in healthcare. 1 out of 4 jobs on the help wanted list when you open up the paper is in healthcare. All because in anticipation of the huge demand that us old geefs are going to make on the healthcare system. The warranty has started to run on the baby boomers' parts, and so they're all going into the shop for new knees, new ankles, new hips, etc. And it's absolutely written there. It has nothing to do with anything that government has done or that politics has to do with. It's all in the numbers. Another thing that is true about a highly over 65 population, 40% of retirees volunteer for organizations. Wow, if you're in the museum business, suddenly you're going to have a huge increase in the potential of folks who are going to walk in your door and say, I'd like to volunteer. What can I do for your museum? What kind of thing can we organize? They may even come with you with a thing that turns out, oh, this is an individual that has a wonderful avocation that they've maintained all throughout their career. They have collected one thing or another, and now they want to take that expertise and give it to you and be a part of your museum. It's a wonderful opportunity we're on the threshold on for all museums everywhere, is this huge number of volunteers that are going to present themselves. Now, at the same time, when you get down to the right hand end of that graph and that one line is going almost straight up, the over 65-year-olds, there's another line that's going almost straight down, and that's the 16 to 24-year-olds. They were already declining, but after the 2007 crash, the birth rates and household formation rates in this country plunged. So, in fact, we now know, looking out to the future, that we will have fewer and fewer entry-level workers at a time when more and more people will be retiring. There will be 50 million vacancies created over the next 10 years. 20 million of them because we created new jobs. 30 million of them because baby boomers retired. And only 10 million people will enter the labor pool. That says there's going to be a huge shortage of workers, and they're going to have to be drawn by the people who are already out there as adults. Oh, so we need an adult learning process of some kind here to take care of this. That's right. There will be a shortage of what they refer to in the labor economists, appropriately skilled workers. The problem is we don't quite know what the appropriate skills for the future are at this moment because we haven't created it yet. It's a vexed subject. There's a lot of people railing that everybody has to have a college degree. That's it. Democrats, Republicans, one of the few things they agree on. Everybody needs to have a college degree. Well, if you look at the next graph in the handout, which is labeled a wave of creative destruction, that refers to a turn of phrase invented originally by Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian-American economist, who in 1911 produced his analysis of how economies work. And in it he said, from time to time, new technologies come along and they create all kinds of dramatic change, at the end of which there is a rising tide of productivity that lifts all the boats. But he says it doesn't happen right off. First, there is a sharp downturn, and he called this the wave of creative destruction. That first, a new technology eliminates huge numbers of old-time jobs, because even when it's not completely refined and done, the new technology is powerful enough to enable us to eliminate a lot of labor-intensive work. And then after a while, when we get everything in place and the infrastructure and the technology has been really perfected, then suddenly there is a surge in new high-value jobs using these new technologies to add more value. And what that graph there, which I originally did after I read the analysis of Schumpeter's work by an economist, Paul David, who went back and did the historical track to say, this looks like what the wave of creative destruction caused by the steam engine, and then he did it for the dynamo, and I said, okay, I'll do it for the computer. And I went back and tracked it, and that's what it looked like, which said that we would bottom out in the destructive part of the wave of creative destruction around 2010, and then there would be a sharp rise in the number of new jobs made possible by the new technology that add new value and restore prosperity. And by golly, it has happened right on schedule. The job creation rate fell from 2000 to 2010, and then it turned around in 2011 and started to go up. Median wages plunged until the last 90 days. In the last 90 days, for the first time, the unemployment rates of the 16 to 24-year-olds, which had stubbornly stayed high even when others went, oh, those went down. The unemployment rates for the handicapped suddenly have started to go up, just in the last 90 days. The unemployment rates for the long-term unemployed, suddenly, the number of long-term unemployed finally began to decline. All has to do with the fact that we've now entered the creative phase of the wave of creative destruction. The numbers of high-value jobs are rising, but we don't know yet quite how they will all mesh together, okay? We don't know. Is it going to be there are a lot of futurists as well as ordinary people that say, well, it's going to be a green industrial economy, and we're all going to be making windmills and solar panels and hydrogen-powered vehicles. And then other people are saying, no, it's going to be a high-tech manufacturing economy with robots and all kinds of automated systems. And then other people that are saying, no, it's going to be high-tech science economy. There are these people that envision all the jobs will require us to wear lab coats or something in the future. We'll all be college-educated scientists. Well, those are visions. The real hard data is not yet clear to us. What is clear, however, that we can accurately forecast the next 10 years worth of mass market technology, and that's what's on the list for your next slide, titled The Mashup with Technology. And the future is now close enough, as far as what we can say about common practice technologies, that a lot of things that visionary futurists have been saying for 50 years, we're going to have cashless society, paperless offices, and it never happened. It will now happen within 5 years. Indeed, we will be cashless. Everybody will carry a smartphone that's also their wallet, their ID, their driver's license. Kansas, first state now, has passed. They're going to issue driver's licenses as an app for your smartphone. So when the cop pulls you over, you simply show them your smartphone. There's your license right there on the screen of your smartphone. And if Kansas does it first, wow. It can't be very far behind before a lot of other people start to do that. All your medical information will be here. So when you walk into the first time for a doctor's appointment, instead of having to get a clipboard and fill out 4 pages of detailed stuff in terms of when were you vaccinated for measles and when? I can't remember that. I'm sure I was. My parents were very good parents, but I can't tell you when. Have you had a tetanus booster recently? I don't know. Instead, all you'll have to do is wave your smartphone at a little sensor on the counter on the receptionist's desk, and blink, they'll have all your records and they'll all be accurate. You've heard a lot about cloud computing. Basically, cloud servers are the factories of the information age. There are about 14,500 of them in the country now. They're anywhere from 50,000 square feet to 500,000 square feet. Many of the biggest ones in the country are all along the Columbia River Valley because they need lots of cheap electricity and they need lots of water to stay cool, because when you've got 50,000 blade computers all humming away at one time, boy, did they generate a lot of heat. And so so Amazon and Google and Apple all have huge server centers up the Columbia River Valley. We build 300 to 400 new server centers every year. All of the stuff that you can retrieve with your smartphone is not in your smartphone. It's in a cloud somewhere. And it can be sent to you the minute you ask for it, on demand, streaming movies, all of it. All of your stuff there in the cloud. The electronic medical record systems will finally begin to slow the rise of medical costs and improve the quality of medical costs. 100,000 people die every year of medical mistakes. And that means that the only diseases that are more deadly than the medical care system is heart disease and cancer. Everything else kills fewer people than the healthcare providers themselves. But that will all be, much of it, reduced because of electronic medical records keeping. And that will all be substantially installed within 5 years, so by 2020. Personal mobile technologies will replace school textbooks. The last K-12 textbooks will be printed next year. It's much cheaper to do it electronically. The teachers think, we're not going to be ready. The whole changeover it's going to be overwhelming. But the cash-strapped school districts are saying, oh, we don't have to buy new textbooks every 4 or 5 years that are out of date before we even get them. Instead, it'll all be updated regularly and routinely. More and more students already have the electronic equipment necessary to do this in terms of their iPad or iPhone, and the few that don't, the school systems can afford to provide for them. If we had to buy it for all the students, that would be a problem. But somewhere around 60% of all students already have some kind of a smart portable device. So away go the textbooks. And one thing that will make it easier for everybody, by 2020, we'll mostly be chatting with our technology. We'll ask them questions and it'll tell us. We'll all have little cyber assistants. Quick, man, tell me, give me an array of the data on grain production worldwide for the last 50 years.
Sure thing, Chief. What do you want to put? I'll break it down this way and this way. Is that right?
Absolutely fine. Imagine how productive all of us will be when we have a perfect, honest, diligent, good-humored assistant at our side. Everything that we need to do. Entertainment. The entertainment companies are absolutely fearful. This year, for the first time, the amount of money generated and the number of people involved in electronically generated media. By this, I'm talking about games created by the gamers themselves. Entertainment created by individuals on YouTube that goes viral, and then a production company says, ooh, can we sign a contract with you to turn this into a television series? Absolutely. All right, that's what's happening. More and more entertainment is stuff that's being created by the general population and then made popular by everybody, as opposed to a handful of entertainment companies that are providing us with all this. More people play fantasy football now than play real football. And the commitment that these folks have to this is astonishing. It's just remarkable. I'm watching the grandchildren play football games in which they've made up teams of the greatest football players of all time playing each other. It's wonderful. And finally, 3D printers will foster mom and pop manufacturing of all kinds. There are now 3 different types of 3D printers, different expenses and different rigorous capacities and precision for everybody to use. They will become like what the blacksmiths used to be in small towns around the country. But they didn't just shoe horses. The blacksmiths were the people that made things. So you went to them, and in fact, I learned about this when our family moved out here to Eugene, and my sister married a local, Bob Needham, whose father had a farm on Goodpasture Island Road, and who had an enormous workshop. He built the kind of equipment that you needed to plant and harvest seeds in wet fields. In fact, when you go look at, and then another thing, that's right, and Tom is married to Joanne, formerly Scromie, a family of 7 agricultural engineers that worked for John Deere and New Holland and the various people that make farm equipment, and all the stories they told about how an old farmer walks into John Deere and says, I got a problem that you might be able to help me with. I've invented a round hay baler. And they said, yeah, we know. Everybody's tried to build a round hay baler. It doesn't work. Well, he says, I built one. I've got it on the trailer out here. I've showed it off at some county fairs, and I have sold over 100 of them. And he's got these used leather bags full of cash that farmers have given him. But I can't make 100 of them, so I thought, could I work with you? And it turned out the man was illiterate. He couldn't sign a contract except with an X, but he had invented a round hay baler. The Bobcat front loader, another man, a turkey farmer, invented that as a way to scoop out the turkey droppings from his turkeys. And so lots of people have lots of capacities that they're not able to realize in the non-information age, but in the information age, everyone has access to it all. And the 3D printer is going to be the local guy, like the blacksmith, that you're going to go to and say, here's a drawing of this thing I've invented. And can you make me one of those? And they'll say, sure. And in fact, it's now called the Maker Movement. And they have the Maker websites, and there are Maker centers, very much like blacksmith shops, popping up all over the country. And they will teach you how to do this, and they will do stuff for people. It seems to me that any good museum, which always has to repair and fix and replace the parts of displays and old things that they've gotten to put on display, hey, we got this device here that will make the matching piece from that Conestoga wagon so that it will be complete. Yeah, and by the way, we're also available with a little ad in the paper saying if you want to have something made by a 3D printer, come on here, we'll show you how to use it, we'll charge you whatever the rate is. Wonderful potential. Now, we're near the end of this chat, and I'm a little behind, but not too bad. The question does rise, as I raised it a little earlier, well, what are the kinds of skills that the general population needs to live in this new high-tech economy? Do we really all need to get a college degree? And the answer is very clearly no. We have all the research necessary, so much so that a whole bunch of corporate leaders back in the early 2000 decade, the first decade of 2000, led by Bill Gates, came up with what they call the 21st century curriculum, They tried to convince the Bush administration that this was the way to go, as opposed to No Child Left Behind, teaching basic skills. The Bush educators were too committed to making that work. But as soon as the Obama administration came in, their education secretary, Arne Duncan, was absolutely ready to go, and they converted the 21st century curriculum to the Common Core standard skills, which are now been approved by 44 states. And now we've got 5 or 6 who either never approved it or now have backed out of it because it's evil, because it comes from the central government and it determines curriculum content, which it actually doesn't. All it does is set the standards for cognitive skills. What do you need to be able to do with your cognitive skills, which are already taught? Reading, writing, arithmetic, basic cognitive skills. But nobody can use them when they come out of high school. And what the Common Core standard says, hey, you have to demonstrate you know how to use reading, writing, and math in order to solve real problems, to apply to the real world of work. And that's all it says. What we do know for sure is that only 1/3 of all the existing jobs in America and 1/3 of all the jobs that are projected to be created over the next 10 years will require the skills of a formal post-secondary degree. Everybody, however, all the workers, including those without a formal degree, will need to have what they call higher order cognitive skills, because anything that is routine over the next 5 to 10 years will be automated or informated out of existence as a job. Machines will do anything that is repetitive and routine, so that all the jobs that are left will be non-routine, which means, oh, there is no set of standards that I can simply, push this button. I'm going to have to ask somebody about this. Yes, you are. Part of the higher order cognitive skills. You've got to know who to ask and what questions to ask. And if they say, no, you're going to have to analyze this, apply certain algorithms. Oh, well, okay, then I'll do that. So that's what they call them. Higher order cognitive skills are either called non-routine cognitive analytic or non-routine cognitive interactive. Those are the skills. There's not one institution in America which teaches those skills. We're trying to make the K-12 system teach them as a part of the Common Core standards. But there's about 40 million adults already out in the workplace, 25 million of them either unemployed or underemployed, who need those skills, and we need to have institutions that teach them. And the evidence would suggest that museums are among those institutions that can provide that kind of exposure of adults to learning new skills, many of them which are common sense if someone would only hold your hand and walk you through those skills. Indeed, the Common Core standards stipulate right in there that educational institutions, K-12 school districts, should partner with employers, museums, and other local public institutions so that the students can have opportunities to apply their classroom learning in real-world work and real-world problem solving. That's what is happening, and it makes a good deal of sense to suggest that museums should begin to think of themselves as an element of the adult education and as well as childhood education function of any local community. Now, I've actually finished my formal remarks, except that I haven't mentioned anything about environment or sustainability, things that I know are near and dear to the hearts of people in Oregon. So I've added the last 2 slides on the back of the handout for you folks. Even though it's actually old news about the future, back in 1970, the Club of Rome did a math model of the future and concluded that somewhere around 2030 we would begin to run out of 6 major components of the consumerist world: energy, food, etc. The Smithsonian Institution went back 30 years after they, or 40 years after they published the report to say, how accurate were these guys? And as you will see from that graph, they were remarkably accurate. The people that all made fun of the Club of Rome because they said, you can't forecast the future of the world with just 6 variables. The world is more complex than that. Oh, indeed it is. Now the Club of Rome's model is up to around 200 different components, but it still gives us more or less that same set of outcomes. And then a year later, the McKinsey Global Research, the oldest think tank in the world, went back and looked at all the evidence and concluded that the evidence is that the current trajectory of growth, that's the inertial forces, especially the growth of the middle class worldwide and middle class consumption that goes with it, will lead to worldwide shortages of fuel, food, water, and materials by 2030, and will probably result in economic nationalism and great global conflict unless we can figure out how to address this problem. Everybody will start hoarding all these resources so that our citizens, and of course keep in mind that all the new high-growth economies in the world, China, India, Brazil, these are state capitalist economies, not free market capitalist economies. The government oversees the economy, and the instrumentalities of that economy are critical to keeping the political system in operation by providing enough consumer goods and services for the general population. So it becomes a matter of political necessity for these governments to have adequate supplies of these things for their people. These shortages, McKinsey went on to say, and their consequences can be avoided. We have the capacity, we have the technology, we have the science to do this. But only if we rapidly apply those technologies and innovations and make dramatic changes in public policies, business models, and social expectations worldwide. Now, how on earth are we going to change social expectations of consumption when everybody assumes that the measure of how well I am doing in life is how much I consume? That's clearly what has driven the Chinese economy once they switched over to the consumerist model. It's clearly what is driving the desires in India. And we're talking about, oh, soon everybody will be able to consume as much as we do. And all the models say, there ain't enough stuff for all of us to consume as much as we do now. We're going to have to do this, and we're going to have to change people's mindsets in order to do that. Genetically modified foods, absolute no-no in Europe, resisted here. Radiated foods, absolutely accepted in Europe, resisted here. We've got now something that you can look at, a wonderful woman who is in charge of the worldwide movement toward circular manufacturing. The idea eventually being that you won't buy a car, you'll lease the car from the manufacturer, and you will drive it, and they'll see to it that it's all perfectly maintained, and when you're done with it, they'll take it back and recycle the vehicle, all the parts and everything, rather than putting it all into the scrap system. And the same thing is true of the appliances and the buildings, etc. These are big changes. And we started out by saying, oh, people don't like to be made to change. And that's true. But they do like change that they choose, that they think will be good and work out for them. Now, who is it that's going to present this imperative to change to the general public? Well, I'm sure the big corporations will try to do it, but we really don't trust them as being fair witnesses. So who's going to be the individual that is the fair witness, that tells communities, that tells adults, hey, here's the nature of the world we're living in, and here are the things that we're all going to have to, we can make this work. We can make this work, but we're going to have to do a lot of things differently. Everybody's going to have to change. I believe that museums in general are ideally suited to be the institutions and instruments of change in society because they're concrete. You can come and put your hands on things and see, look how much change has happened since this museum was built. Look how much change has happened since this town was founded. And look at how much change, therefore, we can reasonably expect as we move forward. Indeed, museums, indeed this museum, could become the first such model, a role model for everybody else, a museum of change that would show people not only historically where we've come from and how long it took, but where we're going and what we need to do to get there. That, to me, is the central message of museums change in the future.